learners, welcome to today's session on a powerful and emotionally loaded poem, Freedom to the Slave by Henry Louis Vivian Derozio. This is a poem that speaks to the soul. It reminds us why freedom is not just a political demand, but a deeply personal, spiritual and human need. Let's explore how Derozio, an Indo-Portuguese poet and reformer of the Bengal Renaissance, uses poetic language, nature and emotion to celebrate liberty and denounce slavery. So today, by the end of this lesson, we will be able to understand how the poet glorifies liberty as a life-transforming force, and secondly, we are also going to analyze the emotional, spiritual and psychological impact of emancipation. And then we will be identifying literary devices like personification, metaphor, synecdoche and many more. And finally, we are going to reflect on Derozio's powerful message about human dignity and universal freedom. Now let's begin with the poet. Henry Louis Vivian Derozio was much more than a poet. He was a passionate teacher at Hindu College, Calcutta, and a leading figure of the Young Bengal movement. His poetry is charged with ideas of liberty, equality, justice and reform, and this reform is particularly inspired by both the Enlightenment and the Romantic ideals. Now, if you look at this poem is one of his best known works, and it reflects his opposition to slavery and his faith in human dignity. Now, let's begin with the epigraph, which is a quote from the poet Thomas Campbell. And as the slave departs, the man returns. What does this mean? It suggests that when a man is enslaved, he loses his sense of self and humanity. But once he is freed, he reclaims his manhood, his identity. And this quote is beautifully capturing the central theme of the poem, Freedom Restores Dignity. Let's look at the first stanza, which talks about joy of emancipation. So let's look at the first stanza. How felt he when he first was told, a slave he ceased to be? How proudly beat his heart when first he knew that he was free. Now let us pause and imagine, what does it feel like to be told you are free after being treated as a property? The poet doesn't just narrate, it makes us feel. The beat of the heart is a symbol of pride, joy and humanity restored. This stanza uses rhetorical questions and exclamatory expressions to amplify the emotional impact. The poet wants us to feel the joy of freedom as if it's our own. Now, let's look at stanza 2, which talks about mental liberation. And here it goes. The noblest feeling of the soul to glow at once began. He knelt no more, his thoughts were raised, he felt himself a man. Beautiful, isn't it? Here, the poet talks about mental freedom. The man no longer kneels. His thoughts are elevated. He is no longer broken. He reclaims the ability to think, to feel and to be a human. Notice the line, he felt himself a man. It is not just physical freedom that we are talking about. It's about identity. And Derozio uses an epigram here, very short, sharp and profound. Now, we are going to stanza 3, where the poet is, using nature as a metaphor for freedom. And the line goes like this. He smiled exultingly to see the wild birds as they flew. He looked upon the running stream that neath him rolled away, then thought on winds and birds and floods, and cried, I am free as they. Look at this stanza, it is full of nature imagery. How Derozio is comparing freedom to birds, winds, rivers, and symbols of movement, energy, and natural liberty. Why do you think he does that? Because freedom is natural, it is not a privilege, and it is a birthright. The use of personification, metaphor, and repetition builds emotional intensity of the poem. And when the freed man cries, I am free as they, it's a shout of joy, identity, and connection to the universe. Dear learners, now let us look at stanza 4, where the poet is talking about sacredness of freedom. And the line goes like this, O freedom, there is something dear, even in thy very name, that lights the altar of the soul with everlasting flame. Look at these lines. Here, freedom is personified. It becomes sacred like a deity. Imagine the soul as a temple and freedom as the flame on its altar. What a beautiful metaphor. This is not just about political freedom, it's about spiritual liberation, the kind that gives meaning to our life. Hope you are enjoying the poem with me. Let's look at the next stanza 5, which particularly highlights patriotism and sacrifice. If I have to read the line goes like this, success attend the patriot, sword that is unsheathed for thee, and glory to the breast that bleeds, bleeds nobly to be free. Here, Derozio takes it to a national level. He celebrates patriots, those who fight and bleed for freedom. Please notice how he is repeating the word bleeds to emphasize the sacrifice done by the people. This is Derozio's very subtle way of reminding us of India's colonial condition. While the poem is speaking of a slave, it also speaks to India under British rule. Now, we are going to look at stanza 6, Gratitude for Abolition. Blessed be the generous hand that breaks the chain a tyrant gave, and feeling for degraded man gives freedom to the slave. Look at these lines. Finally, in this stanza, Derozio honors those who fight for others, not for themselves, but out of empathy. Those who break the chains are not just heroes, they are healers. The phrase generous hand stands for compassion, action, and justice. Now, we are going to discuss the two important aspects of the poem. The first one is the literary devices that make this poem powerful, and the second one is the themes that give the poem its universal appeal. Let us look at the literary devices in Freedom to the Slave. The poet has used literary devices to make their language more expressive, memorable, and impactful. Derozio's poem is filled with such techniques. Let us explore them one by one. The first one is personification. Here, Derozio has given human qualities to the abstract idea of freedom. Look at the line from the poetry. O freedom, there is something dear, even in thy very name. Here, the word freedom is addressed almost like a deity. This makes freedom feel alive, sacred, and powerful, something more than just a political demand. Let us look at the second literary device in the poem, metaphor. Metaphor is used to compare two unlike things without using like or as. If you look at the line from the poetry that lights the altar of the soul with everlasting flame. Here, freedom is addressed almost like a deity. This makes freedom feel alive, sacred and powerful, something more than just a political demand. And this is going to elevate freedom to a spiritual level. It is not just external liberty, it becomes a divine, eternal force guiding human life. Now, we are into the third literary device, synecdoche. Synecdoche is used when a part is used to represent the whole of the thing. Look at the example from the poetry, glory to the breast that bleeds. Here, the word breast represents the whole person who sacrifices for freedom. By focusing on a part of a body, the poet makes the sacrifice more vivid and more personal to the reader. The fourth and most important literary device that is very common in these poetries is alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words. Example is his heart, and the other example goes like breast that bleeds. This creates the rhythm and musicality in the poetry, making the lines more memorable and emphatic. The fifth literary device that we are going to discuss today is apostrophe. This is when the poet addresses someone absent, dead or maybe abstract as well. If you look at the poetry, Derozio is addressing the freedom directly by saying, "Oh freedom." And that's how it looks like, he is addressing to the word freedom as if it were a living presence. And it creates emotional intensity, showing reverence and urgency. The fifth literary device is apostrophe, and we have discussed it. Now, the sixth literary device is imagery. Imagery appeals to our senses, sight, sound, touch and feeling. Look at the line from the poetry, he smiled exultingly to see the wild birds as they flew. The image of birds in flight immediately reminds us of natural liberty, and this makes the reader feel the joy of freedom through nature's symbols. The seventh one is repetition. The poet has continuously repeated words or ideas to put more emphasis on it. For example, words like bleeds, bleeds nobly to be free. The repetition highlights here the depth of sacrifice. It also reinforces the emotional and patriotic intensity. The eighth one will be the rhetorical questions. The poet has used rhetorical questions not to get an answer, but to provoke the thought in the reader's mindset. Let's look at the example from the poem, how felt he when he first was told a slave he ceased to be. The reader is forced to pause and imagine the experience, making the emotions more personal. Now, let us turn to the themes that the poem is trying to communicate through his poetry. Themes, the first one would be the freedom as transformation. The poem shows that freedom transforms life itself, from a slave to a man, from silence to voice, and from humiliation to dignity. Look at the example, he felt himself a man. Here, this theme, freedom as transformation, restores humanity and identity. The second theme of the poem would be human dignity. Slavery dehumanizes a person, but freedom restores dignity and pride. The example would be the proud beating of the heart in stanza 1. It talks about, how human worth lies in liberty, and without it, humanity is incomplete. The third one would be nature as a metaphor for liberty. Birds, wind and rivers all these symbolize freedom. The example would be, I am free as they. These natural elements are born free and it also remains free. So freedom is not a privilege, it is a birthright, just like flight for birds or flow for rivers. The fourth theme of the poem is spiritual awakening. Freedom is not only external, it is spiritual. Look at the example that lights the altar of the soul with everlasting flame. Here, liberty is enlightening the soul and giving its life, purpose. The next theme is patriotism and sacrifice. Derozio honors patriots who fight and bleed for freedom. Look at the lines from the poem. Glory to the breast that bleeds, bleeds nobly to be free. Freedom is precious in nature, but it requires sacrifice and courage as well. The sixth theme of the poem is compassion and justice. The poet also praises those who work for the freedom of others. Look at this line from the poem. Blessed be the generous hand that breaks the chain a tyrant gave. True freedom is not selfish in nature. It is about empathy and justice for all. The seventh one is, the universal freedom. Although written in colonial India, the poem speaks to all struggles for liberty, slavery in the West and colonialism in India as well, and even the modern fights for justice. So freedom is a universal human need. It's timeless and global. Now, we are going to go a little bit beyond the text. We'll try to connect the poem to its historical and cultural context, reflecting on its meaning for us today and comparing it with other voices of freedom, and finally engaging in some critical and creative exercises. So let's begin. Although the poem speaks directly about a freed slave, its significance stretches far wider. Let us think about the time when Derozio was writing actually. The early 19th century was a period of great change. In the West, the movement for the abolition of slavery was gaining momentum. Thinkers, reformers, and leaders were challenging the inhumanity of treating people as property. Campaigns in Britain and America eventually led to slavery being abolished by law. But at the same time, in India, though slavery in the Western sense was not the issue, there was another form of bondage, colonial rule. India was under the British and the national consciousness was slowly awakening. People were beginning to realize that freedom is not only about personal dignity but also about collective independence. So when Derozio celebrates freedom in this poem, he is not only speaking for the slave but also indirectly for the colonized Indian. His message is universal. Freedom is the natural right of every human being. And here is, something for you to reflect on. Suppose, when you hear the word freedom, do you think of it only in political terms? Or do you also think of freedom in social, emotional and personal terms? Think about it. Now, let's begin this closer to our times. Ask yourself, what does freedom mean to me in today's world? Is it just about living in a free country? Or is it also about the right to express myself, the right to think independently, the right to choose my path, my beliefs, and obviously my identity? Take a moment to reflect. If you like, pause the video and write 2 or 3 lines in your notebook. This will help you to connect Derozio's 19th century message with your 21st century reality. For example, if I have to write, I may write, for me, Freedom means being able to speak without fear. Or freedom means the right to pursue the career I choose. Or freedom means equality without discrimination. However, each person's idea of freedom is unique, and that makes the discussion richer. Derozio has also, used some very powerful expressions in the poem. Let us unpack the three, most important expressions that he has used. The first one is altar of the soul. This is a metaphor, as we have discussed. The soul is compared to a temple, and freedom is like the flame that lights its altar. So, in modern terms, when we look at the terminology that Derozio has used, we could say this means our core values, our inner truth, and also our conscience. The second most important terminology in this poem is patriot sword. Here, the sword stands for courage, sacrifice, and also struggle. Derozio is honoring those who are willing to risk their lives for freedom. And in today's terms, we might not carry swords, but we still speak of people who fight for justice, equality, and rights. The third most important terminology is generous hand. This is my favorite one because this refers to the compassionate reformers who fight not for themselves but for others. In our world, this might be human rights, activists, social reformers, or even ordinary people who stand up when they see injustice going on. Please notice how these phrases carry layers of meaning. This is the power of poetry. A few words can open up entire world of thoughts. Here is a question to think about seriously. Do you think freedom always comes with sacrifice? Can freedom ever be complete without responsibility? Please take a moment and reflect on it. If you look at history, every major freedom movement has come with sacrifice. Whether it was the abolition of slavery, the American civil rights movement, or India's independence struggle, people had to risk and sometimes lose their lives. Even in personal life, freedom is linked with responsibility. You must have heard, your parents saying, freedom comes with responsibility. If I want the freedom to speak, I must also take responsibility for speaking respectfully. If I want freedom in society, I must also respect the freedom of others. So perhaps freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Derozio's voice is not alone. Across cultures and centuries, many poets and leaders have sung the same song of liberty. Let us take one example from India. Rabindranath Tagore's poem, Where the Mind is Without Fear. If you have not read this so far, please read it. Tagore speaks of a world where knowledge is free, where the mind is fearless, and where the head is held high. His focus is on intellectual and spiritual freedom. Another example could be from America maybe, Abraham Lincoln's speeches, especially, the Gettysburg Address, where he spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What does this show us? It shows that the desire for freedom is universal. Every society, every age has its own way of expressing it, and that makes Derozio's poem not just Indian, not just 19th century, but timeless and global. Now, when you look at poetry, it's filled with creativity, right? So, I will try to, give you two kind of creative activities. Hopefully, you would enjoy it. The first one could be, write a short 4-line stanza where you personify freedom. For example, you may begin writing like, freedom is a bird with unbroken wings, or freedom is the song the morning sings. Or you could make freedom your friend, your guide, even your flame. The second one that you can try is draw a symbol of freedom. It could be a bird in flight, a lamp glowing in the dark, a broken chain, or an open sky. Then write a single line explaining why you choose that symbol. These activities will help you not just understand Derozio's poem, but also make the idea of freedom your own. Let me end with two powerful lines from the world thinkers. The first one is from Rousseau. He says, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." The second one is from Albert Camus. He writes, "Freedom is nothing else but a chance to be better." Both remind us that freedom is not just a political condition. It is also a personal and moral responsibility. So, as we conclude this lesson, here is a question for you to carry with. If freedom lights the altar of the soul, are we doing enough to keep that flame alive for ourselves as well as for others? Thank you, dear learners, for joining this session. Stay curious, stay courageous, and always question what it means to be truly free. I hope you continue to reflect, question, and nurture the spirit of freedom in your own lives. Thank you.